So today we're talking about Clive Bell and formalist aesthetics. This reading can be found in chapter 3 of your textbook. That textbook selection is taken from Clive Bell's work in the early 1900s entitled Art. Some of the quotes that I'll show you, many of them are from your textbook and some of them are from other chapters of Clive Bell's work entitled Art. So you'll notice as we move into formalist aesthetics, and especially the work of Clive Bell, that we're moving back towards a sort of Kantian approach to aesthetics. Hegel and Marx and even the postmodernists were really interested in the way that art held a deeper meaning for humanity and helped us to think and helped us to understand ourselves. Clive Bell is in that Kantian tradition where he's going to say art is really about perception, and it's a perception that's distinct from those emotions and thoughts and ideas that are connected to life and history and humanity more generally speaking. So as you start reading, you'll see that in this section, Clive Bell is trying to define what is a work of art. And he has a relatively simple definition. For Clive Bell, a work of art is any work that provokes the aesthetic emotion. All right? If that's true, obviously we have to understand what the aesthetic emotion is. And the aesthetic emotion for Clive Bell is the emotional attitude that we have, the emotional experience that we have in response to significant form. Okay? If art is defined by the creation of the aesthetic emotion, if the aesthetic emotion is what we have in response to significant form, obviously we need to know what significant form itself is. And here are a couple of quotes taken from the reading. Clive Bell will say, significant form is lines and colors combined in a particular way. It's certain forms and relations of forms that stir our aesthetic emotions. Significant form is non-representational attributes for which we need only a sense of form, color, and three-dimensional space to appreciate them. All right, so we have the triad here. What is art? Art is what creates the aesthetic emotion. How do I know if I have the aesthetic emotion? Well, the aesthetic emotion is the kind of emotional response you have when you're looking at nothing but lines and colors and three-dimensional attributes combined into a certain way to create a special kind of emotion. Now, Bell doesn't bring this out as much in your section of the reading, but in other parts of his book, you'll see that he wants to emphasize that the aesthetic emotion is not just a claim that anytime you look at art and an emotion is created, that's the aesthetic emotion. The aesthetic emotion he separates from what he sometimes refers to as sort of life emotions, emotions that are already built into life, right? So when you watch, let's say, a drama on television, you feel a sense of loss when the happy couple breaks up, or you feel a sense of expectation when the young person is on their way to make their fortune. And art can reflect those kind of everyday life emotions, but the aesthetic emotion for Clive Bell is just in response to significant forms, lines, shapes, and colors in relation to each other in three-dimensional space, or two-dimensional space for that matter. So here's another quote from Bell. It is because art adds something new to our emotional experience, something that comes not from human life, but from pure form, that it stirs us so deeply and so mysteriously. So it's this deep, mysterious, emotional response we have to just form itself. Which means that the cognitive and representational elements of the work of art are irrelevant. And again, this should remind us of Kant, right, who came before Bell, but certainly influenced him. So to help the spectator, that is us, the viewer, to appreciate our design, that is the work of art, we may introduce into our picture a representative or a cognitive element. So in other words, art can be representative. It can be cognitive. It can have those elements in it. Representative, right, just means that it represents something. Like this is a picture of a tree, which represents trees. Or this is a picture of a historical incident, which represents Washington crossing the Delaware. But that element has nothing to do with art. In other words, if it's doing that historical process or it's referring to trees as trees, that has nothing to do with the art. The art is just pure form and nothing else. In a similar vein, history, the style of the work of art, the time period of the work of art are all irrelevant to quote unquote good art. There's something ludicrous, Bell says in his work Art, about hunting for characteristics in the art of today or of yesterday or of any particular period. So identifying art by these oddities which have to do with, let's say, it was made out of wood, it was made out of bronze, it has this, its pointillism or its realism, is all irrelevant to its value as art, according to Bell, because the only important distinction is the distinction between good art and bad art. So styles change over time as a matter of historical evolution of concepts of art. But what makes it good art is true just as much in a prehistoric cave painting for Bell as it is in a modern impressionist work or a post-impressionist work by Van Gogh. This should remind us a bit of Kant as well, and that's Bell's claim that formalists cannot create a science of aesthetic critique. Bell says, for a discussion of aesthetics, it need only be agreed that forms, arranged and combined according to certain unknown and mysterious laws, do move us in a particular way. But I want to emphasize that these are unknown and mysterious laws. So if you look at someone like, for example, Kandinsky, who is oftentimes thought of as a formalist critic, he actually does create an entire work, Kandinsky does, trying to suss out the rules according to which spatial relationships and color relationships in relation to each other create meaningful form. Bell doesn't think, even though he is an art critic, that ultimately that's possible. You can't create the laws, but you can talk about ways in which significant form is expressed through a particular work of art. Another thing that Bell points out as a formalist is that the true artist is not concerned with helping humanity. He says, I doubt whether the good artist bothers much about the future more than about the past. Why should an artist bother about the fate of humanity? If art does not justify itself, aesthetic rapture does justify itself. So what is the value of art? If you've experienced the rapture, he says, the elation, the beauty of being caught up and appreciating the aesthetic response to colors and shapes and lines and forms in relation to each other, and you felt that emotion that can be felt no other way, then that's a self-justifying emotion. That's what art is about. Everything else is about history or politics or human relations or psychology, but art is about lines and shapes and colors in relation to each other. In the reading, you can see that Bell is worried about this question of if art is essentially a matter of emotional responses to works created by people, then doesn't that mean that what counts as good art is entirely subjective? How can we give meaningful evaluations of art if there are no rules to what gives something significant form, and if I only judge significant form based on the emotional response, this unique emotional response I have to a work of art? Bell's very clear, and he says, to a certain extent, you're right. Our judgment is a judgment that says, and he goes along with Kant on this, our judgment is a judgment that says, this is significant form based on my response, but all I can really discuss is the emotional response that I had when I experienced this specific form in this work of art. So Bell says, you're right, all I can talk about is my own response. There's also one reason why Bell, as he discusses in his work, one reason why he doesn't talk much about significant form or aesthetics or art in music. Bell admits that he can't really hear music the way a great musician could, and because he can't find significant form, the he just says, I have nothing really to say about that. My experience comes from visual art, and that's primarily how I understand art, aesthetics, and significant form. So, how can we then argue about the correct evaluation of a work of art if ancient pottery is just as amenable to aesthetic value as is a modernist work of art? Then how can we say this is a valuable or this is not a valuable work of art? And Bell says all you can really do is point out significant form as you see it to someone else, try to communicate the experience you had, and if you're able to move them into that space of feeling the same emotion in response to the form, then that's how you have to argue for it. You have to give them ways to experience that significant form. And he's aware that this is a tough and a tricky and almost contradictory thing to do, because once I start talking about the work of art and the ways in which I see the form, I might refer to something like its time period or its style or certain principles of relationships between the form and the shape and the color. But none of these are fast rules, but they're ways to get someone looking at a work of art in a new way. And if I can help them feel the aesthetic emotion, then once they feel the aesthetic emotion, they have the right to say, aha, you're right. I agree with you. You've shown me that this is significant form. But all the speaking that I do to get you into that space to see the significant form, I'm talking about cognitive elements. And so those cognitive elements are not the significant form. The significant form and the aesthetic response has to just be when I perceive all these elements together and finally see the beauty. I have the aesthetic emotion itself in my experience. You've noticed that I've been using the word beauty, and Bell actually is a little bit uncomfortable with that. He says somewhere in his work that if by beauty all you mean is response to significant form, then yes, beauty is the same as the aesthetic emotion. But because there are so many different ways we use the word beauty, he likes the word significant form and aesthetic emotion. He prefers us to use those terms. The next reading that we'll look at in our textbook is by Sibley, and what Sibley is going to try to do is demonstrate for us how this kind of formal analysis could work. He's largely working right along the lines of what Clive Bell would appreciate, although in some ways he deviates from Bell's way of thinking. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the next discussion.